Hi, I'm Lilly Hutchins.
My name is Xavier.
John.
TJ Brooks.
And we'll be informing you on the impact of two very important civil rights leaders. When you hear the word civil rights, what comes to mind? Maybe it's positive things, or maybe even negative things. Maybe you think of protests or laws, possibly specific civil rights leaders such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X's influence on the civil rights movement and the lives of Americans of all ages is undeniable. In fact, without their efforts, students across the nation, like those at the University of Kentucky, would not be able to reap the benefits of being a diverse campus. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X had the power to gather and gain the support of many people across the nation, as pictured speaking in front of quite large crowds at a freedom rally in New York and a prayer pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. To this day, these leaders' practices continue to be modeled by protesters. After completing our research, it is our position that both of these leaders still have an incredible impact on members of the community that participate in protests surrounding racial matters.
To emphasize King's power and influence among Americans of the past and present, we must focus our attention on his methods. Martin Luther King Jr. was well known for his peaceful approaches to the civil rights issues plaguing his society in the 1960s, as pictured leading a march on Bloody Sunday in Alabama.
Thomas Jackson, a history professor at the University of North Carolina, states in his article, Bread of Freedom, Martin Luther King Jr. and Human Rights, that King's religious influences in his life taught him the importance of nonviolent resistance against oppression and economic equality. King's nonviolent methods and beliefs were responsible for his success as a civil rights leader in the past and still today in the 21st century because Americans can easily relate themselves to King. In an interview with John Lacey, Sean Trey Carter, a freshman at the University of Kentucky, who is currently taking a class about black writers, Sean Trey is asked,
Would you say that Martin Luther King or Malcolm X has influenced your personal life more?
Between the two?
Between the two, yes.
I would probably say Martin Luther King for the fact that he believed in no violence and stuff like that. Martin Luther King was more of a peaceful person because of him being a Christian, so his beliefs caused him to be more peaceful. So I say that Martin Luther King more because of the fact that I'm also a Christian. I don't really believe in violence and stuff like that to solve problems.
Trey, another freshman at the University of Kentucky as pictured, shares a similar perspective in an interview with Xavier Bonds.
Who do you believe the most prominent leader of the civil rights movement was?
Good question. Well, there's a lot of choices, but I would pick Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay, do you believe that Dr. King still has an impact on the world that we live in today?
Yes.
How so?
Well, if you look at today's society, people still use the same methods as Martin Luther King in protesting. For instance, look at all the NFL players taking knees, and look at all the marches that occur. They're all peaceful and non-violent. The groups that Dr. King started are sort of similar to the Black Lives Matter movement that's been going on for a couple years. It's all there, and none of it would be without Dr. King.
King's beliefs focus on things that are significant to African Americans. In the 1960s, times were rough for African Americans. They were often mistreated by whites and were denied access to many places like diners, schools, and churches. Still today, in the 21st century, many problems African Americans faced regarding civil rights in the past remain unresolved. Along with these beliefs, King's nonviolent approach to a variety of different issues made him less threatening to both whites and blacks, which made his ideals and methods more readily accepted and modeled by his supporters. Similar to Martin Luther King Jr. and his ideals, Malcolm X was able to gain an immense amount of support from Americans as well, using a slightly different approach.
Malcolm X was an enigmatic and highly controversial figure in the civil rights movement whose stances divided a culture. Malcolm X's speeches show that he is more open-minded to other civil rights leaders than often thought, and truly adamant about the importance of independence of the black race in all matters. Though Malcolm X is known across the country for his violent methods, as is illustrated by this image of him holding a gun and peering secretively through a window, it is important to note that he did eventually change his perspective and morph into a more peaceful leader like King.
Malcolm X's controversial nature can be illustrated by his speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, in which he is quoted saying, "The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone." End quote. African Americans at this time were rarely allowed to sit in the same restaurants as whites, so the idea of African Americans having any sort of power equal to that of whites, especially political power, infuriated whites, but inspired African Americans. Similar controversial ideas produced by Malcolm X are responsible for his continued influence on young people today. Chantre Carter, as mentioned before, talks about Malcolm X's violent nature many people are familiar with in his interview.
Malcolm X is more like he was like tired of being pushed. He wanted to be violent and stuff like that. He wanted us to go back and just yell and fight back and stuff like that.
Malcolm X also focused on things important to African Americans, but initially believed the best way to fight for equality was to do so violently or by any means necessary, as he is quoted saying. The mistreatment of African Americans during the beginning of integration was hard to handle, and many believed nonviolent reactions to this injustice was cowardice and didn't make progress toward the betterment of their lives. Though much progress has been made, African Americans are still unfairly treated, and many people today still believe violent reactions are the most effective.
Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. have influenced the lives of many Americans over the years. Their practices continue to influence young protesters today, as illustrated by the side-by-side image of Martin Luther King kneeling in prayer and protest, and Colin Kaepernick, an NFL player, kneeling during the national anthem and protest of police brutality in America. Malcolm X's influences is also illustrated by this image of young protesters by holding up a sign with this notable quote, "By any means necessary."
Freshman Chantre Carter also mentions the influence both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. have on protesters today in his interview.
And would you say that today protesters model themselves more after Martin Luther King or Malcolm X in their methods?
I'd say it's probably it's like in the middle really, because people like they use Martin Luther King for whatever they protest over, like when it's a race thing and like anything that's been happening recently. It's usually they always bring up Martin Luther King and stuff like that, but it's really like what happened in Ferguson. Like it's a lot of violence. It's not really peaceful. There's a lot of violence that goes along, and it's not the same as how it used to be when Martin Luther King was preaching with his audience and stuff like that. So I say it's more of in the middle, because there's a lot of violence that happens in these protests and stuff like that. So
In an interview conducted by P.J. Brooks with his grandfather Thomas Williams, his grandfather compares the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X to fire.
Sometimes in the forest fire, they set back fires so that they can control that fire in hopes of stopping the bigger fire from getting bigger, right? Mm-hmm.
Fire can cause damage, but can allow for growth in some circumstances. This comparison acknowledges the good and bad things that resulted from the two leaders' practices. When you hear about protests today, it's almost impossible to guess what kind of methods were used. No specific leader's methods are used more so than the others, but in conclusion, though Martin Luther King Jr. seems to be more widely known among Americans than Malcolm X, the ideals and methods utilized by these civil rights powerhouses continue to influence young protesters today, as illustrated by this image of a young woman holding a sign of Martin Luther King Jr. at a protest. As mentioned before, civil rights issues as well as racism are still problems people face in America today. At the University of Kentucky, it is no secret that these same issues affect the lives of students. These same students speak out at protests on campus and model the actions of Martin Luther King Jr. and in some cases even Malcolm X.